Hello and welcome to the session. My name is Catharine Morris. I'm a commissioning editor at the Times Literary Supplement. I visited Jaipur for the first time in January as an audience member, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be taking part in this London edition and to be interviewing three fascinating writers, Anjali Joseph, Lijia Zhang and Romesh Gunesekera. I'll introduce our speakers briefly. Anjali Joseph was born in Bombay. She has taught English at the Sorbonne and worked as a writer at the Times of India and as a commissioning editor for Elle India magazine. She is the author of 4 novels, Saraswati Park, which won the Betty Trask Prize and the Desmond Elliott Prize, Another Country, and The Living, which was published in 2016. She has just completed a novel entitled Keeping in Touch, which is set partly in Assam. Romesh Gunesekera was born in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and before moving to Britain, he spent some time in the Philippines. He is the author of 8 works of fiction, including Reef, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, The Match, The Prisoner of Paradise, and Noontide Toll. He has won, among other prizes, the BBC Asia Award for Achievement in Writing and Literature, and he is an elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Lijia Zhang was born in Nanjing in East China, having worked in a rocket factory for a decade from the age of 16, during which time she taught herself English. She moved to England to study journalism. She then returned to China and established herself as a journalist writing for an international audience. She recently moved back to the UK. Lijia is the co-author of China Remembers, a book of oral history covering 50 years of the People's Republic of China. And in 2008, she published a memoir, Socialism is Great. Her novel, Lotus, was published in 2017. Before we start, I should mention that we'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time at the end of the session for questions, so do make a note of anything that occurs to you while we're talking. I'll begin with a question for all of you. How do you think moving to a different country or moving between countries has affected the way you write and the sorts of books you write? Has it perhaps inspired you to write?
Who's going to start?
Would you like to go first?
I have just moved back from Beijing to London, so it's quite a recent thing, and I go to China every 2 months. So I think it was probably what made a big difference was to change the language.
Yes, because you write in English.
Yes, yeah. Yes. I have to say that I started teaching myself English when I was 22 and a half, so probably it's too late to make my English perfect. I'm sure you have noticed that. But I wrote a book when I first arrived in this country in 1990. A Chinese publishing company asked me to write a book about Western image of Chairman Mao, which I agreed very happily, and I found it very interesting. I think the Western image of Chairman Mao very much associated in the image of China. And I wrote the book, I spent many hours at the Bodleian Library, but the book didn't get published. So because it was regarded too negative, rejected by the censor. So ever since then, writing a book is such a big undertaking. So I decided to write in English.
Yeah.
And I found, well, it's still a struggle, as I said, I didn't go to proper university either. Even today, I have problem with when to use the, for example, or with just the in the bed, on the bed, all these little things. Why did I mention bed? But I find also, I think writing English freed me. I guess it's freed me politically because in China there's still strong censorship. My book didn't pass the censorship. I think writing English freed me. I didn't go through censorship, and my books have published internationally. And also kind of freed me literally. English is not my native language, so I structure sentence differently. I borrow saying from the Chinese. And I can afford to have adventure, and I use sentence where try just consciously and unconsciously, I structure sentence differently, and So I think that I can afford to have adventure. So I think I don't know articulate or if what I said makes sense, but I do find a sense of freedom in writing a new language, even though I struggle in the language.
Actually, what was going through my mind was lots of different moves between India and England since the age of 7, and sort of what gets left behind, among other things, lots of books. The last time I moved, I just moved with a rucksack because it was too difficult to think about organizing moving books that I'd moved from Norwich a few years earlier to Assam and then back to England. And so I think about forgetting and what the things that, I mean, especially with reference to books, I sort of have a dim idea about some quotation or some bit in, when I teach, it's also funny because I don't have books, and so I'm saying to students things like, "Ooh, can I have a look at that copy? And also, isn't that the bit where he mentions the thing about the thing that's a bit like the other thing? Do I remember that properly?" And it's kind of, so I think for me there's a sort of legacy of forgetting and half remembering, and that's kind of interesting. I think I made peace with it. When I was a child, I felt a lot of angst about being odd demographically, in the sense that my parents were from, between them, 3 different parts of India, and we lived in another part of India that wasn't any of those 3 parts. And we spoke English at home because it was the kind of language that everyone spoke best, that was a common language, and that was odd. But actually, I suppose enough oddnesses have accrued that I don't mind anymore. Yeah.
Well, on the books part of it, actually, I can't find a book from upstairs to downstairs in the house, so often just go to the library. It's easier. But I think dislocation is actually really very beneficial for a writer. It's great, and I feel very lucky to have been accidentally dislocated from place to place. I don't think I thought about it at all before, but now when I think about it, I think if you're writing at all, wherever you are, you kind of dislocate yourself, because you're always writing about some moment that has passed. You're very rarely, I mean, occasionally you might be writing of the moment, but it's rare. It's certainly rare in fiction. So you always, in a sense, you're writing news from another country all the time, even if you've never moved beyond your own street, because you've actually, in your head, you've moved a bit. So for me, actually, growing up, like the others, but for different reasons, I've moved between different countries, and I think it just made that sense of dislocation magnified a little bit, and therefore maybe a little easier to some extent.
We're going to hear a few readings that reflect the theme of the session, given that Sri Lanka are playing Australia today, but it's not rained off. Perhaps we should start with Romesh, who will be reading from his novel The Match.
I know, this is terribly confusing for me actually, because I have another session on cricket later in the day, and that was when I was going to read about from The Match, and now for some reason I picked it for today. Good luck, Sri Lanka. Can you win the World Cup if all your matches are rained off? That would be ideal. It's a bit like winning the Booker because everybody else dies on the day before, or something like that. I was going to read from the last book, which is called Noontide Tour, because it has a very pertinent first sentence. It says, "Every time I drive across the causeway to Jaffna, I feel I'm entering another country." But that's just a teaser, actually. I'm not going to read from that. I'm going to read from The Match. And do you mind if I stand up so you can see me read? I don't know why you'd want to see me read, but never mind. I'll read from the beginning of The Match. And I think it does connect with what we're talking about, this idea of place and so on. And this is being slightly rebellious, I suppose. I know Jaipur Literary Festival is all about South Asia and everything else. So I'm going to take you to the Philippines, which is a little further away. And at the time I was writing The Match, which was way, way back in prehistory, before actually cricket became the kind of cricket we know now, before the IPL and so on. This is in 2003 to 2 to 5, that sort of period. And the Philippines was a very far away place in Britain. And at the time when the book starts off, which is 1970, I think, it was really not much connected, which gave me a sense of dislocation, because when I came to England to live, I came from the Philippines. And I came from a country which was very, very unusual in Asia. It was regarded then as an English-speaking country. It was regarded as a Catholic country, the only Catholic country in Asia, and the only one that had a colonial history connected with Spain, and then you might say with America. But there are connections with Britain, because actually Britain controlled the Philippines for about 18 months in the early 1900s, which nobody remembers, not even in the Foreign Office here, I think they remember that. But I lived there when I was young, and I never really wrote about it in my books. So it was a bit of a challenge to write about it, and we might talk about it a little later, because 1970s Philippines, particularly Manila, is a country that's not known to many people now. Not many people in the Philippines know it, because the vast majority of the population in the Philippines is young and weren't around then. And the nature of the country has changed radically. So it was quite interesting to, in a sense, set a book there. And I set a book that tried to take on the idea of cricket. And despite the British being there for 18 months, nobody plays cricket in the Philippines. At least so I thought. Anyway, I'll read you just the 500 words I was told to read from the beginning. I'm skipping about a bit in the pages to make it vaguely coherent. And this is the story of Sonny Fernando, who's a young boy in Manila, and he's from Sri Lanka. And there aren't very many Sri Lankans around. A few. And this actually comes from a chapter called Wrist Work. It's a cricketing term for those of you who know. For the first years that he lived in Manila, young Sonny Fernando knew no other Ceylonese in the city apart from his father's friend Hector. Then in the long dry heat of 1970, the Navaratnams turned up from Ceylon. Sonny was nearly 15 and had recently acquired a pair of tinted glasses. Tina Navaratnam was unlike any girl he had ever seen. Tina, with her abundant mane and long, smooth, graceful, racing nose, was almost too much for him. Sally, a breezy American girl from his class, was sitting at a nearby soda fountain with Tina. She called him over. "Hi, Sonny. You know Tina? She's from wherever too. India." "Ceylon," she said, adjusting her teeny orange sundress. "Yeah, an island," Sonny added. It was something his geography teacher liked to bang on about, comparing the continents Sally knew, North America, to the 7,107 islands of the Philippines on which she was now marooned, tipsy on Del Monte juice and wanton capitalism. Tina looked at Sonny and smiled knowingly. He blushed, heady with the sense that they'd already shared more than one secret, an island in the Indian Ocean, and Rustan's menswear, where she had been and he'd seen her. "Do you?" Sonny started. "Oh, so you're Sonny," she said. "Yeah, Sonny." He beamed. "You live here in San Lorenzo?" It seemed easier for him to speak for her. Tina hid her smile with a sip from a huge bowl of halo halo, the ever-present Filipino melange of shaved ice, diced pineapple, papaya, tinned milk, green cherry, ice cream, and a spoonful of red kidney beans. The concoction wobbled in front of her nose. "I saw you," he said. She said, "You like halo halo?" Sonny groped for something to keep the conversation going. "You don't?" she said. Sonny lunged for the safety of the everyday. "Coke?" Sally, who'd been fiddling with her pigtails, picking at split ends, had had enough. Tina, hurry up! We have to be there in 10 minutes. Sunny didn't want her to hurry up. Hello, hello, should not be forced down anybody's throat. I'll see you, he said in hope to one, Tina, and in resignation to the other. But he was happy. He'd managed an almost intimate conversation, spanning weeks, it seemed, of about maybe 25, maybe 30 words, including Americanisms like, hi, okay, yeah, which he'd learned to say without flinching. He turned the corner, and once out of sight, did a quick, wobbly skip of delight. Thank you.
Can I ask why you chose that passage in particular?
Well, I thought the 7,000 islands would be nice to have, and the Americanisms, I thought we might talk a little bit about language, and the change in the English language and how your relationship to it is really interesting. And for me, it was always interesting because, of course, when I first came to England, people always commented on my American accent. And then when I went to America, people commented on my British accent. And sometimes people commented on my Sri Lankan accent.
So Tina is mentioned in that passage. She reappears later in the novel. But Sunny then moves to London in his late teens. Boyd Tonkin, who recently drew up a list of the 10 best cricketing novels in which your novel appears. I don't know if you saw that. He mentioned that he wrote, "Cricket becomes to Sunny a pageant that lends drama and colour to his uncertainties of belonging, race and class." I wondered if you could tell us about those uncertainties, which seem to be a bit of a theme in your fiction in general.
Yeah, I suppose uncertainty kind of reflects my own sense of being at any moment. But with this book, actually, I mean, it is slightly unusual for me. I think it even has a happy ending, which is really unusual. But my previous books often have touched on the very troubled times in Sri Lanka. And the long war has been a shadow over a lot of it. But the cricket story in Sri Lanka had been a very happy one until more recent times, when they won the World Cup in '96 and so on. And I kind of wanted to capture some of that spirit. But I also got very interested both in the idea of the art form and the idea of identity and the way people might identify themselves with different groups. And I'm not really a sports person at all. My cricket experience has never been with a team. It's just been with me and a cricket ball in a sock. But I was fascinated the way, people support different teams. I mean, in football you see it, people who support Manchester United from all over the world. But in cricket also you do find people, the Sri Lankan team have a lot of supporters all over the world. And there's also this weird feeling in sports, particularly in cricket, that you support a failing team. And you can continue to fail and you continue to support. And you wonder why, what's the psychology here? It's like supporting a failed state, You're going to stay with it all the way through kind of thing. Well, that happens too, doesn't it? So I think Sunny is a man who played a little bit of cricket really just at home. And then when he's an older man and he has a son, his 15-year-old son, he tries to reconnect or to connect with him through cricket, through following cricket and going to matches and so on. And it was really to explore that idea of identity, I think.
You mentioned the political backdrop in both the Philippines and Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
It's quite striking that I suppose they feel a sense of rootlessness, partly because they're away from their place of birth, but also because their places of birth have changed considerably in the time they've been away. They're often affected by great violence.
Yes. I think that backdrop is is important. It's also important in this book. But going back to the question about why write, the other thing was I also thought there hasn't been a novel with cricket at the center, and I thought I'd write one before somebody else did.
And then
Because I could see it was going to come at some point. Of course, now there are loads of
it's all down to you. Should we move on to the second extract? Anjali, would you like to read from your novel, The Living?
So this is a novel about two shoemakers, and it's told in the first person in 4 sections, alternating. And this is a bit from the Indian one who makes Kolhapuri chappals in the west of India, in Maharashtra, and he works at home. So I'm going to read. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from this. His name is Arun. I've never made a perfect pair. There's always something. The scorpion's tail on top of the belt curves differently on one side, or there's an asymmetry in the point of the toe. I could say it doesn't matter, no one will notice, that the only perfect thing is a dead thing, that each pair is like a husband and wife. Their imperfections complement each other. At first it's uncomfortable to wear our chappals. They have to be lived with. When they're new, they harass the skin between your big and middle toes. You'll dip them in water and let them dry in the sun. The varnish will come off the sole. You'll wear them in, slipping around. Like a tool used by the same man for years, or a child raised by a certain woman, they'll bear the imprint of your habitual bias. My eldest son, who makes the manufactured chappals, has heard all of this and isn't interested. They came this Sunday, without my grandson, who had a cricket match. My daughter-in-law brought til laddus for us to take to Pune. Can you even remember how to make a proper chappal? I asked my son. I don't know why I feel the need to have these conversations with him. He nodded and waved one hand. His face is smooth, this son of mine, and his eyes slide around. He's darker than I, looks more like my brother. Do you remember how? I persisted. He smiled, but he looked irritated. What would you teach your son? I asked. His eyes slid up to mine, then he looked away. He exhaled. Was that last night's alcohol? His teeth are red, too much chewing tobacco. My wife came with tea and bhajias. She put her small hand on his shoulder. He looked up and smiled, and his face changed and became absorbed, open. If Prakash had been better in school, he would have been like his younger brother, I thought, as I poured hot tea down my throat. I watched him eat, his fingers shiny with oil. He is strong, taller than I. He likes his work in the workshop with the men and drink and listening to songs on the radio. I don't know what else he gets up to. His wife is a practical woman, she wouldn't complain. And Anil, he's not like my other grandsons in the city, but he's a good boy, straightforward. When his cousins come here, he shows them things, the pond to swim in, or they go to the fort by bus. They look up to him, but they also turn their heads to each other and smile. His mother is always with him. They are different. They live alone in a way. A bus takes them to school. They have a uniform, a routine. From the cooking, I smell methi, besan, oil. I thought about the two brothers, so different. My second son is like a version of me projected into the future. He's industrious, always wanting to get ahead without knowing where. He has his mother's softness, her intelligence and optimism. There's something about us that neither of them has, but not every bit of material can be used.
Thank you. So we have these two characters both making sandals in their different countries. Did you have the explicit intention of crossing cultures and countries in this book, or was their background more incidental?
No, I didn't have the intention at all, and it's quite an odd choice. But it's just sort of happened. I guess that's what came to me. Yeah.
And you said that you write in the tradition of R.K. Narayan. Could you tell us what you mean by that, and how his style and approach differ from other Indian writers?
Yes. Do you remember what else I said about that? I'm not.
My sense was that another tradition is more exoticized, perhaps.
Okay. Actually, when you were talking, Romesh, about the importance of dislocation, which was really nice, I was thinking that I always worry about not being somebody like Narayan, who grew up in a small South Indian town, was totally steeped in that town, and could recreate another analogous South Indian town so beautifully. And I sort of always had this anxiety that, a bird might call and I would misidentify the bird, or I wouldn't know exactly what tree I'm looking at or whatever. But I think it's the everyday that's beautiful in Narayan. So I guess that is probably what I was thinking about. And he also, actually, that's really pertinent with this book, which I kept in my mind and in the drafts calling shoes, and the publisher said absolutely not. But he used to always write novels that had a profession in the title, so now I can't think of any. The Bachelor of Arts, or the Painter of Malgudi, the Painter of Malgudi, or there's one about a printer, I think, Mr. Sampath the printer and stuff. So yeah.
Neil Mukherjee called your most recent novel a beautiful and profound book that distills with uncanny precision and truthfulness the flow and movement of inner lives deep under the surface of things. You said that as a reader you don't care much about plot. I wondered if you could tell us more about that, what you personally look for in a work of literature.
I think it's really voice, actually, that I look for, mainly. And I don't really mind what someone's writing about, even things that I may not be very interested in. I mean, the kind of sport that I don't know much about, or war, something I haven't, experienced, for example, fighting in a war, I mean. So I think it's really that. Yeah, it's voice. That's what I look for. But I know that's not necessarily everybody's, on everyone's wish list in the same way. Yeah.
And you wrote a piece about realism in literature. How important is realism, do you think?
To whom?
To the reader or to the writer?
I think it's really interesting. I was thinking about story more recently when I was watching Game of Thrones, and that's sort of got elements of realism, like the English swearing and kind of very contemporary things in some ways, but also obviously it's not in a realist mode at all. I think realism it's sort of become a slight holy cow more latterly, but actually it is just one tradition in a series of traditions, right? And it's sort of interesting that there have been kind of overt deviations like magic realism or whatever, but also other types of deviations or modifications of supposed realism, I guess. The one thing about realism I'm quite interested in is when people write about things, like the amount of stuff that there is in books or the type of stuff that there is in books. I think that's interesting.
What kind of stuff do you mean?
Well, there's a famous essay by Roland Barthes where he talks about the opening of a Flaubert story, and he talks about some boxes in a storage room in a family's house, and he says basically he sort of accuses the realist writer of bringing too much stuff in there because they're too attached to their own stuff and their own experience, and they kind of don't want to let that element of memoir or personal lived experience go. But I think stuff is sort of interesting. I mean, stuff is kind of its energy at the most slow-moving level, right? It's like stuff is the result of decisions that we've made, things we bothered to, for example, in a dislocated life, bring with us. It's kind of interesting. And sometimes it's the little bits of absolute rubbish that one is most attached to. Yeah.
And you've spent some time learning Assamese. What do you think that's brought to your writing?
I don't really... I think reading Assamese fiction really changed my experience of writing. It's a very literary culture, and there's a lovely book of short stories actually translated by D.N. Bezborough called, I think it's Classic Assamese Short Stories. It's published by Penguin India, if you could find that online. But there's really, really modernist writing with a really sophisticated use of myth and sort of folk elements, always intrinsically ironical. I don't know how to sort of describe it, but where irony is kind of a medium of existence, not really a mode even. And I think that's fantastic. The only thing that the closest comparison that comes to mind is how in the 16th century plays are so sort of meta-theatrical. I mean, it's actors on a stage, feeling like actors on a stage, talking about being actors on a stage, but also acting out a story. That's kind of what Assamese fiction is like. There's always this element of being aware of telling a story and being aware of what it's like to listen to a story, even as you tell a story that's not about telling a story at all directly. So,
I think I've got that.
So I was just really impressed. I hope in the end or in the long run it'll just up my game a little bit. But yeah.
Excellent. Should we move on to our third extract? Lijia is going to read from Lotus.
Well, before I start reading, I would like to make I've got to the point to make earlier we talked about language. And the first Roman Empire famously said, when you gain a new language, you gain a new soul. And I don't know if I got a new soul, but I do think that writing or speaking a different language bring out different personality. For example, when writing English, I feel I'm less reserved and more daring. And for example, if I wrote the book Lotus in English, if I written handwritten in Chinese, I think the sex thing probably will be less detailed, less explicit. That's just in writing Chinese, just too much language. You know, my mother's language. My mother would read, but she cannot read English. But I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm not going to read any sex thing here. I'm going to read the opening of chapter 3. Lotte is the name of the leading character. She's a sex worker. It's a book about prostitution, and actually just prostitution for me, just a window to observe the social tension brought by the dramatic social transformation, things reform opening up. Each chapter starts with a Chinese saying. Anybody here have been to China? Wow. I have quite a few new friends here, and I'm sure you'll agree with me. Chinese, such a rich language and so many interesting sayings. So every chapter starts with the saying. This chapter 3, starts with this saying: "If you stay long in a fish market, you'll soon get used to the stink." Standing outside the Moonflower massage parlor with 3 other girls, Lotus flashed her red smile at every passing man. She leaned against the glass front of the parlor, one leg bent like a crane's. Luring in the clients with sweet and oily words consumed a surprising amount of energy. The sun had just rolled down behind the western hills, burning a red trail in the sky. The high-rises in the city center blocked the sea breeze. Without wind, the soup of store air thickened, filled with smell of fuel, shampoo, cheap perfume, roast duck, and fried noodles. In the twilight, the girls lined up along the street looked more colorful than usual. They leaned against the buildings or against each other. The luckier ones sat down on white plastic chairs, chatting like magpies, cracking melon seeds between their teeth. The parlor and the saloons were sandwiched between grocery stores, restaurants, and drugstores. The buildings were all one-story structure encased in white ceramic tiles and fitted with glass front. Behind the windows, silk or velvet curtains obscured the view inside, where a pink lamp glowed. Not very good reading, so I'll stop here.
That's great. So this massage parlour, the one that Lotus works in, is in Shenzhen. I'm probably mispronouncing that.
Yeah.
What is the significance of that location? Why did you choose that location?
Well, start with Shenzhen is known in China as China's capital of sins. There are particularly well-developed sex industry. And also, it is cross-border from Hong Kong, where some businessmen keep Ernai, modern-day concubine mistress. And also, Shenzhen is the place where China first introduced the economic zone. So it's a place China started to experiment with capitalism, market economy. So this book is very much looking at the impact of the, market reform opening up on Chinese society.
And this novel, it brings together something of your grandmother's life, doesn't it, with your own life. So could you tell us about you, what inspired this novel?
20 years ago, right in front of my grandmother's deathbed, I learned a long-kept family secret that my grandmother was a prostitute. And I was shocked. Of course, you don't associate with a grandma with a sex worker, especially my grandmother. She brought me up. And then my mother explained that my grandmother was born in a very poor family, and she became orphan when she was 6-7 years old. And then she was adopted by her aunt family. When she blossomed into a young woman, she was sold into a brothel. And she met my grandfather on the job. That was another surprise. I remember my grandfather as a shaky old man. He was a John, but anyway, so he was. He was very smitten with my grandmother. He bought her out and installed in the household as his concubine.
Right.
And her life was easier, but was not very easy because concubine didn't have the same status as wife. So in 1949, when the Chinese communists took over power, and Mao ordered the man to have one wife, so he decided to keep his concubine, my grandmother, and take his wife. So my grandmother was always very grateful to the Chinese communists. So anyway, so ever since this story, I was very fascinated by prostitution. And then just a few months after that, I worked as a journalist, so I went down Shenzhen to on a reporting trip. And one evening, I went to the hairdresser near my hotel, and I said I want to cut my hair. So, but the 3 girls there wearing low-cut dresses, and they were just giggling. Said, "Sorry, we didn't know how to cut hair." The hairdresser didn't know how to cut hair. I looked down the floor and realized there was no hair shavings, and suddenly it clicked what kind of place it was. Yeah. So I chatted with girls and learned that they were all, from poor hinterland, and then they come down to Shenzhen, worked at the production line, and life was really hard and pay was bad. And then one of the colleagues got a job like this. And prostitution is illegal in China. This massage parlor and hair salon just all front. So anyway, I just then that's when the seed for this novel started, because prostitution touches up on some pressing issues China is facing: migration, from rural to urban, gender issue, the gap between gender inequality, and of tug of war between modernity and traditions. So anyway, that's how I had this idea. I wrote in China, some people heard me because of my memoir about my experience working at a missile factory. So I keep telling people, sorry, this is not another memoir based on personal experience. I've done a few jobs, but not prostitution. Only prostitution I've done so far is intellectual prostitution, trying to sell my articles into several places.
But you were able to write about factories as a result of your 10 years in the factory.
Yes. I worked at a rocket factory, but I was no rocket scientist. I was the most junior factory worker.
And what were the circumstances in which you went in to work for the factory?
Poverty. I was 16, and we were just poor. My mother just took me out of the school, anyway.
Do you think your early life and the struggles you went through, does it inform the work you do now? You're a journalist as well.
Yes, I guess I worked at the factory. My life wasn't easy, and I guess that made me more resilient. And I taught myself English as a way to escape my life at the factory. Of course, now looking back and learning English has effectively changed my life. And also, I think because I'm coming from poor background, I'm always interested in little people struggling in the bottom of the society. I remember I met somebody around. He said, "Who's your father? Some general?" I said, "No."
In the book, we read that Lotus, like the city herself, is torn between the past tradition and modern desires. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. What that sort of conflict is.
And Lotus is a very smart girl, and she's not very, very happy with the life in the village. She wants to go out, and so she's very smart, but she has her family. She has been taken out of school. So I said I'm not a prostitute, but I do relate to her life and how she struggles to better her life. And then she just fell into this prostitution, and she really struggled because of her tradition in the village. Expect women to be, chaste and to this kind of really.
She keeps it a secret, doesn't she?
Yes,
for a long.
Yes. Of all sex workers in China, I've been to many of them. They all live from another city, and they make up stories. So I got a grand job working as salesperson. I make good money. So they never tell the truth to their family, but they do send money, and that's the way because the Chinese feel out piety, but also something to make themselves feel better for themselves.
I've got a question now for all of you, any or all of you. Bearing in mind the international outlook of your characters, do you have a particular audience in mind for your writing?
I'll just answer this question briefly.
Yeah.
I think writing is a different ball game to writing for domestic audience and to writing for international audience. If you write for example, if I write for a Chinese audience, there will be a lot of presumed knowledge. But when I'm writing for international audience, I think I need to explain, Cultural Revolution, for example, what is Cultural Revolution, market economy. So I need to find a way.
And that's done through Bing. Is it the character of Bing who is a photojournalist?
Yeah. But when I just recently I read some earlier draft. I was too journalistic, and our Cultural Revolution I was in a bracket. A crazy movement launched by Chairman Mao. But anyway, so writing a novel, you have to find a way to let information come out more naturally.
Yes, I wondered, in fact I noticed that in Anjali's novel that there are quite a lot of references to birds or somebody who's heard on the radio or a kind of tree, and they're not translated. Is that quite a difficult judgment call to make, how much to spell out?
Well, I do remember being a young child reading books in Bombay, and it was sort of fine if you didn't know exactly what a hansom cab was, if Sherlock Holmes jumped in a hansom cab, and you kind of got what was going on,
Yeah.
And if you cared, you could look it up, and I think it's even easier looking up stuff now, so I think it's fine. I don't even really know what an international audience would be as such, or an audience really. It's just one person reading at a time, isn't it? So,
yeah.
Yeah.
You're working on a new novel. I don't know if you'd like to describe it for us. Was it secret?
Well, I've described it as a dysfunctional love story with a tangential involvement of a magic light bulb. I think that's as far as I could go at this point. Yeah.
Can't wait for that. Do you have a sense of your readership as you're writing?
No, I think it's really difficult, this actually, because when I started writing way back in the previous Iron Age or whatever, we understood that actually writing didn't reach out very much. So, first-time novelist, when I was sort of learning to write or trying to write, I knew would have an audience of about 800. And if you took out the family members and friends, it would be an audience of about 3. So when I was writing, I suppose, I was writing in English, and my mother could read English, so I knew there was one. But yeah, and I was writing for somebody who would have been like me, I was thinking in my head perhaps, going into a library, and those old-fashioned libraries where you don't know what the books are because they all look the same, they've been bound or whatever, pick it up and you read it. But when I did write a book, I think I did have a sense of an audience, because I discovered with Reef, my first novel, which I was lucky enough for a few more people to read than I expected. And in those days, you didn't have the internet and email, and I remember getting a couple of letters, but one letter in particular, and that has perhaps affected a little bit, because somebody wrote and said that they loved reading Reef, but it was really difficult because they kept bursting out laughing on the bus while they were reading it. And I had thought I'd written a really tragic, sad novel. So I discovered that I can do a bit of comedy. But I discovered actually that what I thought was a private language, because particularly in that book, part of it is about how somebody does take control of a language. The narrator, in a sense, takes control of the English language and makes it his own, and therefore does use words that aren't explained and so on. And I thought all of that was going to be just relevant to me. And in a sense, almost subconsciously, I did put in a few kind of linguistic jokes and so on. And that's what suddenly I found some other people managed to pick up on. So I realized there was actually somebody other than my mother who was going to read my book. But beyond that, no. I mean, writers may think they have audiences.
I think we're going to move to the audience. Oh, sorry.
Can I just make a very quick point? And I read The Reef, which is a beautiful book, and I And I was just so pleased when I was working for my master at Goldsmiths. And I had the pleasure as Romesh as my guest tutor. So I'm just thrilled to be here.
It's a very special thing, actually, to be, to have that relationship where I remember you talking about this idea you had. I think you found out about your grandmother and so on. You didn't quite know what to do with this material, and you were thinking of writing a non-fiction book about it, and you were thinking about this photographer. And my son here becomes a photographer, so I think we may have talked a little bit about that. I can't remember. But it's very nice to find, that stories can bring people together, and here we are on the stage together.
Yes,
Brilliant.
I'm very grateful for all the tips and advice you give me.
So I think we're going to have some questions. Should we go to the front row here?
There was an expression in the 80s in China, 为人民服务, which means to serve the people.
Yeah.
And now the environment in China seems to be 为自己服务, which means to serve yourself. Now, in line with what Sanjoy said about the role of literature, I was interested in knowing from the three of you whether you saw the role of your writing as enlightening a very disenlightened society that we live in now, or whether you saw it as basically you pursuing your own goal.
Wow. Who wants to take that?
Actually, I don't think about society, but I really do think about a form of illumination for a reader, and I think a novel, I don't really see a novel as necessarily only entertaining. I think it can be quite transformative. I've certainly experienced that while reading. That doesn't necessarily mean that the author is aware of exactly what it is that they're doing, but when it's working, they're allowing something else to come through them, and that thing can awaken a reader just to what's inside themselves, perhaps. But society, no, I think that's too abstract. But yeah, some form of illumination, absolutely, in the best reading experiences I've had, certainly.
And thank you for your question. Particularly, I'm so impressed you raised the question in Chinese, serve the people. Yes, and so that shows how China has commercialized. China has become. And after my factory, I started this new career as a journalist. So I feel passionately that we must report the truth. And now, since I write in English, and I feel, in my small way, I want to be the cultural bridge to use with my article, with my books, to try to tell people around the world and where China is coming from, what's happening now. Anyway, I think a writer has that duty and responsibility to do so.
I think there are all sorts of different sorts of writing and writers, and I don't think I don't think there's a necessary duty for a writer. If anything, it's only not to bore your reader, perhaps. But there is, in a sense, writing that can be just entertainment. But for me, I think the writing can be all of those things, but it also has to be meaningful at some level. And I do want a book to be something that when you've read it, you do feel that was time well spent, that it was it was worth being alive to read the book, whatever the subject might be, however painful even it might be. But other than that, no, I think in terms of society, it does sometimes remind me. At one time I was during the war years in Sri Lanka, when there was a particularly difficult security time. I remember I did do a reading in Colombo, and at the end of it, I was signing some books. And as you sign, because you take a book and you open it and you say, "What's your name?" So I did that, and discovered that the chap was in full uniform. He was an army man, a senior general, whatever. And when I asked his name, he gave me that. So I said, well, what do you do these days, as it were? And he said he was in charge of the security of Colombo. And I said, well, shouldn't you be doing something more than reading a book here? You know? But at the same time, I thought, well, it's good if somebody can actually stop time for a moment and think.
A question over here. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, my question really follows on from the previous one. The title of your session is Words Are All We Have. It's a slightly more modest statement of objective than the pen is mightier than the sword, which is usually used of writers. But my question really is, how do you see the relationship between writing and activism? And many writers have become social activists or political activists. Do you see that as part of your role, or is storytelling a more important part?
So connected to a previous question, but I suppose it's a more
Shall I
active
start?
form.
For me, I think they're two separate things. But then that's the kind of writer I am. But I do admire many writers who are activist writers. I think that's perfectly possible. But I think you can also be a writer who is absorbed in your writing, but as a citizen, you could be activist, and you have certain responsibilities in the way you behave as a citizen. And I think the two go together. I don't think any of us are just one thing. We're not just writers. We're not just readers. We're not just daughters or sons, mothers or fathers. We're all, combination of these things.
I think I have two thoughts. One is, I don't know about activism, but I think if you're able to sort of see things clearly and connect with yourself in some way, the action that can come out of that has more authenticity and purity and maybe content in the future than things that are just reacting to other things, ideally. But also, can I point out that books start revolutions, and we're quite near the British Library, in the reading room of which Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, which had lots of impact in the world. So, I mean, of course, things can result from books, we know that.
Would you like to respond, or shall I go on to the
I
next
think
question?
that people have different passion and see how they see themselves. And I'm just a writer and a small cultural bridge.
Should we go over here?
Thank you very much. When I moved from Dubai 10 years ago, I wanted to gift my library to various churches in India, or projects in India, let's say. And it was a mixed library from the 60s and 70s, and it had certain Christian books in it, etc. It never got delivered because in Kerala, in the south, they wanted a certain tax on it. They wanted me to pay an intermediary solicitor, etc. And in Delhi, there was completely different answers, but equal taxes on rather dusty. Sorry? Yeah. So, what's the value that the present Indian government should put on words and libraries? What tax would you put on it?
I think we're out of time almost. So could we have one very brief answer, perhaps?
The value.
Well, as the only Indian on stage, I must apologise for the interception of your library. But I'd also like to apologise for the present government. And I mean, I don't know if words are going to save us, but at least it's a start. I mean, silence may not do it. So, yeah. Thank you.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much. Thank you.